Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks.
Good morning.
I'm going to ask that everyone who is not speaking mute themselves. We'll start in hopefully 3 minutes. But thank you all for being so prompt. I also want to add that this is live streaming on Facebook, and I'm going to do speaker view, so only I should be visible. But if you don't want your name or image on Facebook just in case, then I recommend you can rename yourself and you can turn off your video, no worries. Or image on Facebook just in case. Okay. Your video, no worries. Okay, I was just checking. I am the only face that I can see. So if you want to turn your camera on, Facebook will not see you. And if you're on Facebook, then hi. Okay. Okay, so it's 9:30. I'm gonna give a few more minutes, maybe like 1 or 2. Thank you all so much for being on time. But we did have a couple more people RSVP'd, so I'll just give them a second. Great. Okay, so I'm letting people fill into the Zoom room, but if you're joining from Facebook, hello. We're gonna start in a minute or 2. So I'll just give like 1 more minute. Okay, so I'll get started. I am going to record this presentation. So again, no one is visible on Facebook except for me, but if you don't want your face or your name in anything, then feel free to change your name, turn off your camera, that's totally fine. But again, I'm the only one visible on Facebook. So thank you all so much for coming. Today's, okay, so today's presentation is about housing discrimination in our lives, specifically housing discrimination in Suffolk County. So I'm Nicole Grennan. I'm the community educator organizer with Erase Racism. Erase Racism is a regional nonprofit. Sorry, I'm still letting some folks in. Erase Racism is a regional nonprofit which focuses on racial equity in education and housing on Long Island. And our mission is to expose forms of racial discrimination, to advocate for laws and policies that eliminate racial disparities, and to increase understanding of how structural racism and segregation impact our communities and region, and to engage the public in fostering equity and inclusion. So this is our 20th year. Since 2001, we have been mobilizing Long Islanders to successfully expose and remedy racial discrimination and segregation in our region. So today we're going to be talking about housing discrimination. We're going to look at examples of housing discrimination. We're going to look at the Fair Housing Act, and we're going to look at some myths and realities of housing discrimination. And why are we discussing these things? So it's really important to have these discussions because it helps not only to protect ourselves and our families, but also to educate our broader community, and so that we can take actionable steps against housing discrimination, which affects our whole community and our whole region. Throughout this presentation, we're going to be looking at a few different examples of housing discrimination, fair housing laws, and we hope that you engage in today's discussion. You can use the chat. I'm going to ask you to interact a few times. And if you have a question, you can feel free to unmute and ask it. There is a raise hand feature, and you should not be visible on Facebook, but your voice will probably be on Facebook. So just as an FYI. Great. So we're going to start with a question. And I would like for you to put your thoughts in the chat. So you can either message me individually, or you can just message the whole group, but no worries about being right or wrong. This is a space where we're all here to learn. So, Long Island is a diverse and integrated region. Do we think that this statement is true or false? Let me open up the chat. So we have two false. False, 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 false. Okay, you guys are good. So yeah, the correct answer is false. Long Island is actually one of the most segregated regions in the country. It's the 10th most segregated metro region in the United States. And I believe that Nassau is actually the most segregated suburb in the United States. And this is not by accident. So we're gonna look a little bit at why this is. So we're gonna discuss a short history of Long Island, our housing discrimination. So starting in the 1930s, the federal government had a policy of developing housing that was racially segregated. So Levittown, many of us have heard of it. It's in Nassau County. It's an example of this development. Most of us learned in school that it was the first suburb, which is true. But we don't learn always about the racial covenants that were involved in Levittown and many other housing developments at the time. So in the 1940s, William Levitt and his company bought land on Long Island, which was an area of potato farms at the time. And within just a few years, they were able to develop the land into mass scale affordable homes, and they built a total of 17,400 homes. However, non-white homebuyers were explicitly blocked from accessing these homes in Levittowns, including GIs, so the soldiers who were returning from World War II. There were a series of practices that limited access to housing, including what is known as racial covenants in the deeds and leases of homes, federal policy of racial discrimination that was embraced by banking, insurance, and real estate industries, and a practice known as redlining, which we're going to look at. But so basically, the federal government told William Levitt and other developers like him that they would not fund these housing developments if they didn't include racial covenants in the deeds. So according to the 1960 census, of Levittown's 82,000 residents, 0% were African American. In 2017, Levittown was just 1.73% African American. So of course, we're gonna discuss why that might be if we know that housing discrimination is not legal anymore. So this is an example of a racial covenant, and I'll read what it says because it's a bit fuzzy. It says, no property in said addition shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or in part to any person or persons not of the, let me just let people in from the waiting room, not of the Caucasian race. So sorry. hosting and facilitating. So this is in all the Levittown home deeds. If you go back and look at the original deeds, it's still there. Of course, it's not enforceable anymore, but if you look, you'll still find it. So that was saying at the time that no Black people, they could not purchase homes in Levittown originally, but they also couldn't repurchase from the white people who had originally purchased them, and they could not rent it or lease it. So the practice of housing discrimination was also perpetuated by this practice known as redlining. This is where the federal government created a system of color-coded maps to identify which communities were worthy of government-backed loans. So you'll see on the left that there's some red, some yellow, some blue, and some green. A community with red was considered risky, and green was considered safe to buy a home or rent a home. Riskiness was not actually based on a resident's ability to pay, but rather the presence of Black residents. So the red neighborhoods were denied access to affordable loans, and Black families were not allowed to live in white or green neighborhoods. Majority white neighborhoods were identified as safe, even if the area's income or ability to pay was actually lower than that of the majority Black middle income neighborhoods. So even though this practice was ultimately made illegal, its effects are still seen today in racial segregation. And this practice was led by the federal government and upheld by banks and real estate agencies. And if you look, there are lots of red line maps of the tri-state area, but there are actually none of Long Island because there weren't enough Black people on Long Island at the time to develop redlining maps. And that was partly because of the racial covenants that were in the deeds preventing them from living here in the first place. So now I have another true or false question. Black people only want to live with Black people, which is why they and we are so segregated. Do we think that this is true or false? So we have one false, lots of falses. So false. Okay, we have no dissenters here. So yeah, it's true, it's false. I mean, it is false, it's correct. The fact is that actually most Black people prefer racially integrated communities. So you might hear sometimes that, okay, we might have been segregated because Levittown and stuff, but now we're segregated because actually like Black people like to live with Black people, white people like to live with white people. But that is actually false. And so for the past 19 years of race racism has documented how housing discrimination plays a significant role in determining the neighborhoods where African Americans on Long Island will most likely reside. And studies have shown that even the most affluent Black and Hispanic homeowners are segregated into majority Black and Hispanic communities with high concentrations of poverty. Studies about neighborhood preferences often pose questions about so-called self-segregation, which I was just mentioning, as if this is not a structural racism issue, but an issue of preference. But we actually asked a large pool of Black Long Islanders about the characteristics they value in a neighborhood. And our questions included perceptions of their current neighborhood and thoughts about their ideal neighborhood. We also asked about their personal experience with housing discrimination and their desire to stay in or move away from Long Island. So to complete this survey and to better understand the patterns of residential segregation on Long Island, we contracted with the Stony Brook University Center for Survey Research, and we conducted a survey of Black Long Islanders in 2011. So this was actually the largest survey of Black Long Islanders to include questions about housing-related issues. And the survey respondents were people from neighborhoods in Nassau and Suffolk counties, which had population that was at least 60% African Americans. So intensely segregated neighborhoods. 90% of those interviewed had lived on Long Island for at least 10 years. Respondents shared with us that the prevalence of segregation on Long Island makes it difficult for African Americans to find areas with the ideal racial mix. And you can see here that 69% of respondents chose an even mix of 50% white and 50% Black as the ideal mix. and only 1% of respondents said that they would like to live in a neighborhood that is all Black. And roughly 4 in 10 African-American residents would live in a mostly white community if schools had a mix of Black and white students. And the final thing to note is that additionally, some respondents in the survey shared that they felt they had been discriminated against in the purchase of their home. So what does this tell us? That actually the data shows that Black people would prefer to live in integrated communities, so they're not self-segregating. It's an extreme minority, 1% of respondents who said that they would prefer to live in an all Black neighborhood. So I have another true-false activity. Black and Hispanic people have lower incomes, and that is the main reason for their segregation in lower income racially segregated communities with concentrated poverty. Do we think that this is true or false? So I see false, 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 false. Yes, it's false. So the fact is that the average Black or Hispanic household actually lives in a poorer neighborhood than the average low-income white resident. So while Long Islanders do have different average income levels based on race, it's not true that all higher income white, Black, Hispanic, and Asian people live together, and all lower income white, Black, Hispanic, and Asian people live together. So it's not income segregated. Given that Black people prefer integrated communities, as we just saw, this pattern of racial segregation, regardless of income, suggests that factors other than income are contributing to the high levels of racial segregation. So in fact, the average affluent Black or Hispanic household lives in a poorer neighborhood than the average low-income white resident, which is what it says on the screen. So now we're going to look at what housing law currently exists in this country. The Fair Housing Act is an act that was by the federal government. It was passed by Congress and signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson. And it was enacted on April 11th, 1968. So 1 week after the assassination of Dr. King. And it was enacted in response to the protests following Dr. King's murder. It was part of the historic Civil Rights Act of 1968. The law prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of houses against people with specific protected characteristics. And we're going to discuss these characteristics and look really deeply at this in a moment. But I'll just read. The law states, to ensure that no person shall be subjected to discrimination in the sale, rental, or advertising of dwellings, in the provision of brokerage services, or in the availability of residential real estate related transactions. So this was not a new idea. The idea that unfair housing should be illegal actually goes back to 1866. And even today, sometimes many race cases often plead 1866 violations. So the 1866 law was deemed to be this nation's first fair housing law. When a case was decided by the Supreme Court 3 months after the Fair Housing Association passed in 1968, and it's routinely used to challenge race discrimination to this day. It's a one-sentence law, and I'll just read that too. All citizens of the United States shall have the same right in every state and territory as is enjoyed by white citizens, thereof to inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property. So the 1866 law covers all housing and housing transactions, and race is defined broadly based on who was considered non-white in 1866. So there is a case law that says it covers discrimination against Hispanic people, Arab Americans, and even Jewish people, because none of these groups were considered white in 1866. It also has a longer statute of limitations than the Federal Fair Housing Act. So if an owner of an owner-occupied four-family unit advertises, they are still exempt under the law. So even though that's a very old law, it was our original one, and it still affects housing discrimination cases today. So the next part of this is who is protected by the Fair Housing Act. Before I tell you, I'll just ask you to put in the chat, who do you think is protected? What characteristics do you believe are protected under the Fair Housing Act? You can put in the chat again, sorry. Okay, I must have stumped everyone. So you can write any of the, okay, great. So I see people of any race or national origin. Yeah, so exactly. Any other thoughts? Who is protected by the Fair Housing Act? Or what characteristics are protected by the Fair Housing Act? Race, ethnicity, national origin, families with children, religion. Yes. Great. So these are great. So let me close the chat. So the Fair Housing Act, the federal law protects against discrimination of people based on certain identities, which are now known as protected characteristics. It used to be protected classes, but they recently changed it. So these include your race, color, sex, religion, national origin, handicap, and family status. So this is the federal Fair Housing Act. Individual states have additional protected categories as well. And we will cover New York a little bit later in the presentation. And even Suffolk and Nassau County have some more specific protections. But first, we're going to talk about the federal Fair Housing Act. So it had 3 goals. The first goal was to end discrimination in the renting or selling of homes or apartments. So, for example, there is a notice in New York State that discusses your rights through fair housing, whether you are buying or renting. The office of the realtor that you go to should have information available on fair housing and on your rights as a home buyer. And we're going to discuss these protections throughout the presentation, but I'm going to pull up what this actually looks like. So what you should be looking for when you go to a realtor or a realtor's office. So this is the Fair Housing Notice. It lists the protected characteristics of New York State, which are many more than the federally protected characteristics. The notice also shares examples of fair housing violations, which we'll discuss in a minute. Even though this document is only available in English at the moment, it's important for us to understand its contents. And so you can see it says federal, state, and local fair housing laws protect individuals from housing discrimination. And then it lists the New York State protected characteristics. And then the notice ends with a information on how to file a complaint and information about the offices, one of which is actually on Long Island in Hauppauge. And this sign must, again, be posted in all real estate broker offices and at all public open houses. So you can look for it at an open house if you are going to open houses. So what acts or activities are illegal under the Fair Housing Act when it comes to renting or selling homes or apartments? Again, I'm going to ask everyone to share their thoughts in the chat. So I'll give a minute to share some responses. What acts or activities are illegal under the Fair Housing Act? And this is not a trick question. Okay, so I see barring housing because the occupant has children, not showing a property because of person's race or color, redlining. Great. Definitely, yeah. So those are all correct, and there's a couple more. So refusing to rent, sell, or negotiate for housing is one. Making housing unavailable or lying about the availability. Denying housing. Establishing different terms or conditions in selling or renting. Providing different accommodations or amenities. Block busting. Denying participation in housing-related services based on your protected characteristics. So this last part is really important because, for example, it's illegal to refuse to rent somebody an apartment because they are Black, but it is not illegal to refuse to rent somebody an apartment if they simply cannot afford it. And additionally, just because you don't get a specific apartment doesn't mean it's discrimination under housing law. So you have to basically prove that it's based on your protected character, you're possessing a protected characteristic. And this applies to many different types of housing, single family homes, apartments, multifamily homes. Does anyone have any questions about what's on the board right now? Anyone not know any of what any of these mean before I move on? You can put it in the chat. Okay, so Emily asked, what is block busting? So block busting is it was a practice in which realtors would tell I believe it started in the 70s, but realtors would tell people that they would tell white families that there were Black families moving into a neighborhood and their property values were going to go down because Black people were moving in, which was not true. Their property values would not go down. And also, these realtors would manufacture that there was going to be this massive influx of Black people and it was going to affect property values. So none of that was all false. But so white families would sell their homes at less than the value it was. And then these realtors would resell the homes to Black families for a higher cost. And so that myth still is present today. If you hear people might still say that if a Black family moves in, then that's going to affect the value of the property, which is simply not true. It's been proven, and we're going to look at in Newsday, their investigation, they found a couple of instances of that. Carmen wrote, also called panic selling. Yep. So Christina asked, is age a protected characteristic? I believe that it is. So you can't not sell someone because of their age, but there are exceptions when it comes to like housing for like 60 and over housing and stuff like that. And Georgiana wrote, also called white flight. Yep, so that's all connected to block busting. Great. So there are actually other examples that I don't have on the board. I'm just gonna read through them, but it's kind of a lot. So it is also prohibited to falsely deny that housing is available for inspection, sale, or rental. To make, print, or publish any notice, statement, or advertisement with respect to the sale or rental of a dwelling that indicates any preference, limitation, or discrimination. It's prohibited to impose different sales prices or rental charges for the sale or rental of a dwelling. So you can't charge someone more money because they're from a protected characteristic, for example, source of income, which someone mentioned. You cannot use different qualification criteria or applications or standards or procedures, which includes income standards, application requirements, application fees, credit analyses, sale or rental approval procedures, or any other requirements. So basically, if you're going to ask for pre-approval for a mortgage, you have to do that for everyone. You can't just ask from certain people. If you're not going to ask for pre-approval, then you can never ask. So it has to be consistent. That's on the realtor. So you cannot evict a tenant or a tenant's guest based on their protected characteristic. You cannot harass a person, fail or delay performance or maintenance of repairs, limit privileges, services, or facilities of a dwelling, discourage the purchase or rental of a dwelling, assign a person to a particular building or neighborhood or section of a building or neighborhood, For-profit persuade or try to persuade homeowners to sell their homes by suggesting that people of a particular protected characteristic are about to move into the neighborhood. So that's what we were discussing with blockbusting. Refuse to provide or discriminate in the terms or conditions of homeowners insurance because of the race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, or national origin of the owner and or occupants of the dwelling. And you cannot deny access to or membership in any multiple listing service or real estate brokers organization based on protected characteristics. So that's a lengthy list. This is all on the New York State website. And I'm happy to provide resources to everyone who has registered for this meeting after this is over. So tenant-on-tenant harassment and neighbor-on-neighbor harassment is also illegal under the Fair Housing Act when it is based on a protected characteristic. But proving these claims can be quite challenging under the Fair Housing Act. Things like cross-burning and vandalism can usually be covered under the criminal section of the 1968 Civil Rights Act. However, severe or pervasive name-calling, comments made, or other conduct based on protected class, it may be covered, but the onus is on the person who is suffering these to prove that it's as a result of their belonging to a protected characteristic, which can make it quite challenging. So I'm going to play a video from the Newsday study that was published in 2019. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's called Long Island Divided. The study found that housing discrimination still happens today at a rate that may surprise us. So the video shows us how two different people, a white home buyer and a black home buyer, were treated differently by the same real estate agency. And it's also important to remember that Newsday used paired testing, which means that both home buyers had the same financial background. So we will watch. I just have to share a different screen. Great.
The home buying experience for Blacks was a sharply different experience than it was for whites in our testing. We conducted 39 match tests involving Black testers. In 19 of those tests, the Black tester experienced unequal treatment. That is 49% of the time.
Every place I went to, basically, they treated me very well, and they showed me that, you know, they were really interested in what I wanted.
But it was only after they got back to the office and compared them that we noticed that the treatment wasn't equal.
I think what I am surprised at is the sheer discrepancy between the two of us.
I like Freeport. So a lot of people say to me, oh, I don't care, I'll take Freeport, all the houses are cheap there, I don't care about the school district, I don't have any children. I said, but you gotta protect your investment.
After looking at the area that she went to and the area that I went to and all the nice choices that she had so much more than I did, I felt I was slighted a little bit.
As Black testers, they were getting directed to more diverse neighborhoods, or that they weren't getting equal service compared with white counterparts.
Every time I see and hear things like that, I'm still like very surprised.
Petrie declined to comment. Coldwell Banker stated, incidents reported by Newsday alleged to have occurred more than 2 years ago are completely contrary to our long-term commitment and dedication to supporting and maintaining all aspects of fair and equitable housing. Lisa Culpo, a young Black female tester in a particular test, she was asked for identification proving who she was.
Well, I do need a copy of your license. Oh, or something, some form of ID.
The thing is, because I've gone on so many tests where they have never asked me for ID, well, why would they need ID?
All right, but this is routine. I mean, this is something that's not unusual.
Yeah, no, that's what we do with everyone.
Because,
if you want to give it, you give it.
okay.
Don't forget, I'm going out.
That didn't happen when her white matched pair counterpart went in. to the same agent and ask for the same criteria.
All of these surrounding areas are great, and they're great for your commute, and they're great for your husband.
And Lisa's listings were in more diverse neighborhoods like Hicksville and East Meadow. Her white counterparts' listings were in more white communities. Petrelli declined to comment. Kelvin Toon is a Black man in his early 50s, and he went in to meet with an agent involving a test in the Brentwood community, a community that is 80% Hispanic and Black. The agent communicated to Kelvin, our Black tester, that she enjoyed meeting with clients from the Brentwood area.
Every time I get a new listing in Brentwood or a new client, I get so excited because they're nice people.
When we sent Kelvin's counterpart in to meet with the same agent, the white tester was actually warned about Brentwood not being a nice place.
The nursing home we need to be near is in Brentwood.
Okay.
And so we found a couple that are in Brentwood.
Pretty close to each other.
Okay. And it just seemed like those would be handy also for going
Do you
to
want
visit.
to give me them and I'll look into them for you? Or?
Yeah, I can do that.
That warning came later to the white tester saying there was concern about gang activity going on in Brentwood. This agent wanted the white tester to know about, but that information wasn't provided to Kelvin, the Black tester. The listings centered Black tester Kelvin in Brentwood with 27 house listings, while the white tester got 0 listings in Brentwood.
I mean, she's telling him these some of the nicest clients I've ever worked with, et cetera, et cetera. He's steering me away from that. And not only in the listing she sent me, but also in telling me that about the gang violence.
Vickery said she had warned only the white tester about gang activity because she had not been aware of it when she met with the Black tester, despite widespread media coverage. She also said her business partner, Gene Gillen, sent the listings to the Black tester. Gillen said the listings were unquestionably prepared based on Vickery's criteria, and that Vickery may have sent the listings using Gillen's email. She said she didn't know the race of the Black tester until she met him later on a house tour. Keller Williams, which was their employer at the time, released this statement. Keller Williams does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. All complaints of less than exemplary conduct are addressed and resolved. What we found when we looked at the total number of listings, agents provided 50% fewer listings to Black testers on average than to their white counterparts.
Great. So, real quick, was there anything that surprised you or that stood out to you about that video? If so, you can put it in the comments. It's possible that it didn't surprise you. So Carmen said no, nothing surprising. Not surprising. Yeah. So some comments are sadly no, it's so blatant and egregious. Yes, definitely. It's really disappointing. So we see from that video that even when a real estate agent is treating us kindly, they may be offering us differential treatment, right? So it might be impossible to know if your treatment is different from another person's unless you're setting up a paired test. And so it's important to be aware of strategies that have been used previously, such as steering people to certain communities. So I'm going to play one more video from this one. This video focuses on the denial of equal service. So white home buyers were allowed to see homes and listings, but Black, Hispanic, and Asian home buyers faced obstacles, such as getting pre-qualified or pre-approved for a loan, which the white home buyers did not have to face, which is something that we looked at as being prohibited under fair housing law. So we'll take a look and discuss the findings afterwards.
Newsday's investigation of real estate practices on Long Island, we discovered that agents engaged in disparate treatment that amounted to denial of equal service.
Oh, so that means I can't go out to see anything. I won't do it. You can try another person, but I don't have the time.
They imposed additional stipulations on the minority testers that they did not impose on the white tester. For example, they would tell a minority tester that the minority tester needed to be pre-qualified for a mortgage in order to receive either listings or to get a tour of homes.
So you need that.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Can't even look at listings or anything.
I wouldn't know what to show you.
However, that same stipulation was not imposed on the white tester.
Is it possible to for you to start sending me some listings?
I can send you listings in those areas.
Particularly, Blacks were on the receiving ends of this unequal treatment. In one test, Johnny Mae Alston was the Black tester and Cindy Parry was the white tester. And they met with Anne-Marie Quealy-Bichon at Signature Premier Properties office in Cold Spring Harbor.
You know, I don't know my way around out here.
They asked for the same thing. As often happens, the agent discussed getting pre-qualified or pre-approved for a mortgage by a bank, showing how much a buyer can spend on a house.
You pre-qualified, I asked. My husband's working with somebody in the bank, and he will obtain a pre-approval from the mortgage lender.
Neither had been pre-approved or pre-qualified. Here's what the agent told the Black tester.
So I really need that. I won't take out anyone unless you have a pre-qualification limit. So I need to know that I can't pre-qualify for a mortgage. Oh, so that means I can't go out to see anything. I won't do it. You can try another person, but I don't have the time.
And without pre-approval, here's what the agent told the white tester.
What is your availability? When can we start looking at houses? I would say not this coming week.
Cindy received 79 listings from this agent. Johnny Mae couldn't get any listings.
That's me, 11:30. Would you rather come with me? Rather than follow me? Yeah, okay, but I'll make sure my card's sparkling for you.
And Cindy, the white tester, received 2 home tours. Bichon did not respond to requests for comment. Another test involved the Black tester, Kelvin Toon, who was going to see an agent by the name of Aminta Abarca at Keller Williams in Garden City.
You called your wife and you signed the commitment.
Over the course of 2 visits, Abarca stressed the need to sign an exclusive buyer's agreement.
If we have a contract, then I'm working exclusively for you.
Without the contract, she refuses to take him on a tour of homes. So as Kelvin is driving back from his aborted meeting with the agent, Kelvin's counterpart, the white tester, receives a voicemail from the agent asking him when can he go out on a tour of homes.
Hi, David. How are you? This is Aminta. I'm just calling to see if you've started to do some house hunting now that holidays are over.
She ultimately takes the white tester without him signing any kind of exclusive agreement with her.
West Hempstead, we saw 2 in West Hempstead. The
Yeah.
2-family one,
Yeah,
okay?
right.
And then we saw the beautiful renovated one.
Abarca did not respond to requests for comment. Keller Williams' national spokesman wrote in an emailed statement, Keller Williams does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. All complaints of less than exemplary conduct are addressed and resolved.
I have coordinated more than 12,000 investigations across the country. I have personally done over 1,500 tests. If I go into a real estate office and I say, I'm looking for a house in this price range, I work for this employer and I make this kind of money, generally my word is taken. And I'm not asked to show pay stubs. I'm not asked to go get pre-qualified by a lender. I'm not asked to do a variety of things. But an African-American man matched with me may well be grilled about his financial circumstances, may be asked to be pre-qualified. It suggests that African Americans and other people of color are not always taken at their word for what they can afford.
In the meantime, I will wait for that pre-approval from your friend or whoever you feel comfortable with. When I get that, I know you are serious about buying.
It certainly has major consequences for that person and their opportunity to obtain housing.
Perez declined comment. The company Perez worked for at the time of the test, Remax LLC, wrote that franchise owners have taken issues raised by Newsday seriously and are committed to following the law and promoting levels of honesty, inclusivity, and professionalism. A law firm representing Douglas Elliman Real Estate, where Perez now works, said Perez dealt more readily with the white tester because he said he consulted a friend working for a mortgage company, while the Asian tester had talked with a friend retired from a mortgage lender. This point is critical, a firm partner wrote. In 7 of Newsday's 86 paired tests, the agent's conduct amounted to a denial of equal service. That affected 5 of Newsday's Black testers, 1 Hispanic tester, and 1 Asian tester.
Okay, so I already see a comment in the chat that says this is so disappointing and difficult to watch. I completely agree. Does anyone have any other thoughts that they want to share?
In Newsday's,
sorry, you can drop in the chat. Any other reactions to the Newsday videos? I'll also fill in, so this was in 2019 that this report was released. It was 3 years of undercover investigations. And so in December of 2019, the New York State Senate convened. They requested that all of the realtors come to testify. None of the realtors showed up. So this past September, they subpoenaed them. And basically every realtor, no realtor had been punished. And they basically all denied in front of the New York State Senate that they had committed any housing discrimination or unequal treatment. So just this past month in February, early February, the New York State Senate passed 11 bills, fair housing bills, which require more paired testing, harsher consequences for realtors who are found to have discriminated or not followed fair housing laws, and so on and so forth. So that's promising that there's finally legislation happening. But you saw the statement that Keller Williams made, but the reality is that they had not taken any action. So any more comments on the videos we just watched before we move on with the federal fair housing law? And you can watch the New York State Senate trial they had in September on YouTube. It's quite interesting. And Elaine Gross, our president and founder, testified as one of the fair housing experts. So the second goal of the Fair Housing Act is to end discrimination in mortgage lending. When we were talking about redlining, one of the reasons that it was so successful was that if you live in a redlined neighborhood, there was no access to affordable mortgages. So discrimination in who gets access to mortgages and the mortgage rates people have access to determines their ability to pay. So let's examine what's protected under the law. If this will move on. Okay. What acts or activities are illegal under the Fair Housing Act when we're talking about mortgage lending? Prohibited under the Fair Housing Act, refusing to make a mortgage loan, setting different terms or conditions for mortgage, interest rates or fees, setting different requirements for mortgage loan purchases, refusing to make information about mortgage loans available, and discriminatory practices in property appraising, again, based on your possessing a protected characteristic. So that's really important. So for example, it is illegal to refuse to provide a mortgage to somebody because they are Black. It is not illegal to refuse a mortgage to somebody if they simply do not qualify for a mortgage. Additionally, it is illegal for a bank to refuse a mortgage loan based on the racial makeup of an area or a community. So that is illegal. That would count as prohibited under the Fair Housing Act. So we have one more video for you. This video is an example from Marquette University in Wisconsin, which shows that how mortgage lenders across the country discriminate against people of different races. And again, this is one video, but it's not an isolated case. We know that these patterns persist throughout the country. So let me switch my share again.
Mortgage lenders discriminating against minorities.
With the help of a Marquette University study, the I-Team uncovered troubling statistics in the way minority home buyers are treated.
Investigative reporter Eric Ross live at Marquette tonight to explain. Eric.
Good evening. While this 18-page study done by Marquette University reveals lending discrimination on a nationwide spectrum, tonight we're investigating whether it's happening right here in our own backyard. And what we found may, or quite frankly, may not surprise you.
I have bought 3 homes before. I have not been discriminated because of my last name. It doesn't sound like an African-American.
Tracy DiDonatella says her name has helped her avoid discrimination, but for many Americans, that's not the case.
It's something that you hear about. You see news clips, you see lawsuits.
Marquette University professor Dr. Andrew Hansen is the lead author behind this study on mortgage lending discrimination.
There's a small segment of the market that definitely treat minorities differently.
Hansen sent emails to more than 5,000 mortgage loan officers across the country. The emails were similar, asking for information on current mortgage rates and loan options. The only difference, the name of the person sending the inquiry.
They each get an email inquiry from one white sounding name and one African American sounding name. And then we see, do they treat them differently?
The results, Black sounding names received fewer responses from loan officers. For example, emails from Jake Kruger got a response 72% of the time, compared to Deshaun Banks, who only received a response 62% of the time. Loan officers also sent fewer follow-up emails to inquiries from African-American sounding names.
Prior to doing the study, what I thought was, what I would find is there's no discrimination, right? This is something that happened 50, 60 years ago.
The people we spoke with in Milwaukee are not surprised by the findings.
I don't think it's right at all, but what can I do? I think, everybody deserves a fair try, no matter the color or race.
Discriminatory lending practices during the 2004 to 2008 housing boom resulted in 2 of the largest cash settlements ever between mortgage lenders and the Department of Justice. $335 million from Countrywide, now affiliated with Bank of America, and $175 million from Wells Fargo.
They're doing something that isn't right, that isn't fair.
The I-Team decided to copy Marquette University's study with local mortgage lenders. Using one white and one Black sounding name, we emailed 10 lenders asking about loans. Ethan Schmidt, a name commonly associated with a white male, received a response 90% of the time, but Jermaine Booker only received a response in 80% of our inquiries. Wisconsin Mortgage Corporation in Brookfield never replied to Jermaine's inquiry. But less than 6 hours after receiving an inquiry from Ethan, a compliance manager responded saying she was out of town and one of her loan officers would be in touch. The very next day, a senior loan officer followed up. We contacted the company's vice president for answers. He declined to talk on camera, but in an email, he acknowledged inquiries from both subjects were received, but says a loan officer was never alerted to contact Jermaine Booker due to a computer system error. He goes on to say the company is now doing some additional testing to make sure this doesn't happen again.
That can still impact a home purchase. You're not going to get a loan quick enough, right? And you might not have a real estate agent that's interested, or you may miss out on the preferred house. Mortgage discrimination is illegal.
Now, if you're denied a loan, you legally have the right to know why. Consumer experts always encourage you to pull your credit report first before applying for a loan. That way you could look for inaccuracies. Inaccuracies in your credit report could result in a lower score. And of course, that could impact whether or not you ultimately get approved for a line of credit to take out a mortgage. Now, if you feel you've been discriminated against in any portion of the lending process, we walk you through who to contact and what to do on our website. Just head over to TMJ4 tmj4.com. For now, reporting live at Marquette University, Eric Ross, today's TMJ4.
Eric, good information.
So, of course, this video is in Wisconsin, but we know that Long Island is not exempt from this. So, and I will go through some steps that you can take if you feel that you've been discriminated against later in the presentation. So, the third goal of the Fair Housing Act, the federal one, is it makes it unlawful to make discriminatory statements or advertise property that expresses a preference for certain backgrounds or excludes a protected characteristic. And it makes it unlawful to threaten to interfere with anyone's fair housing rights, even after a person or a family moves in. It's important to note that even individuals have to abide by the Fair Housing Act. So if we live in a single family home or an apartment building, there could be Fair Housing Act lawsuits against individuals as well, not just real estates or governments. Great. So as was mentioned in the video, if discrimination takes place, the burden is on the buyer or the renter to prove it, but you're not alone. So if you feel that you've been discriminated against, you should make a call to a fair housing service, the county or the state. And there are experts there who will help you to understand your specific situation or circumstance and will guide you along in the process. So these are some people who you can call, and I'm going to put them up at the end, so no need to rush to write them all down. You can take a screenshot now or later. But first, the Suffolk County Human Rights Commission is the Suffolk County government, and they can take legal action against a realtor or agency in Suffolk County. The Long Island Housing Services and the Fair Housing Justice Center are nonprofit, non-governmental organizations that help people assess their housing discrimination cases. So in the second Newsday video, you may have seen Fred Frieberg works for the Fair Housing Justice Center. So at the state level, there's the New York State Division of Human Rights. And if the incident involved a licensed realtor, the New York State Division of Licensing Services. In fact, this summer, New York State passed a law which would allow for the removal of a real estate agent's license based on discriminatory actions. So then we have to demonstrate that the realtor discriminated, which is where the other agencies come in handy. So I'm going to move on from this slide in just a second. And again, we'll have these numbers at the end of the presentation. So I have another true false question. Housing discrimination was outlawed under the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and discrimination does not happen today. This one shouldn't be too complicated because I think I've already answered it. Yeah, so I see a lot of false. Also, for anyone who wants those videos, I'll be sure to distribute them after the presentation. But the Newsday ones can be found on Newsday's website. They're free for everyone. You don't have to subscribe. So correct, this is false. The fact is that we just saw the Newsday report Long Island Divided showed housing discrimination on Long Island still occurs. So even though the Fair Housing Act outlawed discrimination, racial segregation is still a problem in 2020. So the Newsday study found that 19% of Asian homebuyers were discriminated against. 39% of Hispanic homebuyers were discriminated against, and 49% of Black homebuyers were discriminated against. So that's about 1 in 2 Black homebuyers. So even in 2019, we see how pervasive housing discrimination continues to be, especially on Long Island. So Long Island today. So these are some cases, some that Erase Racism has been involved in and some that we have not, about housing discrimination on Long Island. So the first two had to do with the apartment availability not being the same for African American and white renters. So Erase Racism did some paired testing, and we found that basically the realtors were telling African American people that there's a long line, there's no vacancies, etc., and they were showing the white people apartments. So 2014, we successfully reached a settlement in a housing discrimination case filed against a Mineola landlord. And in 2016, Erase Racism, the Fair Housing Justice Center, and 7 African-American testers successfully settled a housing discrimination case against the owner, management company, and superintendent of an apartment complex in the town of Smithtown. And then we had there was a discrimination of financial services settlement. So in July 2018, Suffolk Federal Credit Union reached a settlement with Long Island Housing Services for discriminating against African Americans and Latinx people looking for information about mortgage loans. And in 2014, the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of New York announced the filing of a federal civil rights lawsuit alleging that the town of Oyster Bay engaged in a pattern and practice of racial discrimination against African Americans in violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act. So what happened was basically that Oyster Bay was required to have affordable housing. So they said, okay, but we're only going to open it up to people who already live in Oyster Bay. And at the time, because of housing discrimination and Long Island's history of segregation, only 3% of the town of Oyster Bay was Black, and only 1% of that 3% was income eligible. So without saying Blacks need not apply, that's essentially what they said by setting up this housing program with these stipulations that prevented Black people from accessing the affordable housing. In enacting the Fair Housing Act, Congress declared it is the policy of the United States to provide, within constitutional limitations, for fair housing throughout the United States. So Congress directed HUD to make sure that neither the agency itself nor the cities, counties, states, and public housing agencies it funded discriminate in their programs. The municipalities have the obligation to identify and remove barriers to address the embedded segregation in America. Since this was caused by the government must address it, basically. And Congress also intended that HUD programs be used to expand housing choices. So not only are we addressing housing limitations, but also housing choice, and help make all neighborhoods places of opportunity, providing their residents with access to the community assets and resources they need to flourish. So unfortunately, too many jurisdictions have taken HUD funds, but have failed to fulfill their obligations to further the goal of advancing fair housing. And Newsday's investigative report, Long Island Divided, shows that the promise expressed in this policy has yet to be realized here in particular. So we're going to move on from the federal law sort of now to New York State human rights law and also Suffolk County law. So the state protected characteristics are more expansive than those under federal law. So on the left, you'll see what's protected under the Federal Fair Housing Act. And then under New York State human rights law, we have race, religion or creed, color, national origin, sex, disability, family status. Those are all the same. But we also have marital status, age, someone was asking about that earlier, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, lawful source of income, military status, and status as a victim of domestic violence. And then Suffolk County goes even further, adding group identity, which can mean but is not limited to actual or perceived age, citizenship status, gender and sexual orientation, and also citizenship status. So that falls under group identity, and it's also its own clarification. And as I mentioned earlier, there are, even though age is protected by the New York State human rights law and Suffolk County law, there are some exemptions which protect senior-only housing. So these are the exemptions from fair housing protections. Under federal law, it's senior-only housing and owner-occupied 4 units or less. And for New York State, it's owner-occupied housing with fewer than 2 units. And for Suffolk County, it's owner-occupied housing with fewer than 2 units. So those are the exemptions for to the law. Who is enforcing fair housing? At the federal level, we have administrative enforcement by the HUD Secretary and civil enforcement by the U.S. Department of Justice for pattern and practice. At the state level, the New York State Division of Human Rights protects New York State homebuyers alongside New York's Attorney General. And here on Long Island, we have the Nassau and Suffolk County Human Rights Commissions. There are also various private fair housing and civil rights organizations, which are throughout our community, including the Fair Housing Justice Center and Long Island Housing Services. And additionally, complaints and lawsuits can be filed by individuals. Though we strongly recommend going through a pre-existing organization at the local or community level if possible, since they can offer you their expertise and experience. So even though people are primarily segregated by race, families and individuals may also face discrimination based on other factors. And one of the most recent protections was for lawful source of income. So often people will receive income that does not come from a job. This is called non-wage income, and it can include child support, alimony, and supplemental security income. And these are all legal ways to pay for housing, but they often get discriminated against. And if you live in New York City, there are actually additional public assistance programs which might benefit you. But if you try to use one of these to get a home, and you're told that that's not, you can't use that as a source of income for your mortgage or rent, that is a violation of fair housing laws. And as of 2012, Suffolk County implemented a plan to ensure that people with limited English proficiency have meaningful access to agency services, programs, and activities. So even though a real estate agent may not have materials in your language, any Suffolk County government office should have resources available in Spanish, Creole, in addition to Spanish or Creole, in addition to Polish, Portuguese, Chinese, and Italian. And for more information or support, you can email lep.coordinator@suffolkcountiny.gov. And so I'll just leave that for a moment in case anyone's writing down that email or taking a picture. Great. So any questions at this point? A lot of the work that we do at Erase Racism is trying to bolster these fair housing laws so that they're more enforceable, and also so that people are aware of their rights under fair housing laws. So now we'll do another interactive activity, sort of a memory game. So in 2019, Newsday found that real estate agents discriminated against Black homebuyers blank % of the time. You can put your guess in the chat, or maybe not a guess if you remember. It looks like everyone has been paying attention. So yeah, the answer is 49% of the time. And there's a typo, and then against Latinx homebuyers, it was 39%, and against Asian homebuyers, it was 19%. So it's clear that from these numbers alone, that housing discrimination is rampant even today. 1 in 2 Black homebuyers, 1 in 5 Asian, and 1 in 3 Latinx. And similar to Newsday's study, as we previously mentioned, Erase Racism has conducted a number of paired tests of people looking for apartment rentals. So some other instances were in Mineola. Erase Racism and the Fair Housing Justice Center investigated a 75-unit apartment complex. And the investigation revealed federal and county violations of fair housing law. The apartment complex lied about the availability of spaces, gave higher rates to African-American testers, and made apartments unavailable because of the testers' race. This case went up to federal court and resulted in successful settlements for the testers. And then in a similar test in Comac, Erase Racism and the Fair Housing Justice Center used paired testers to investigate a 107-unit apartment complex. The investigation revealed serious discrepancies in treatment, such as providing welcoming responses to white testers, while Black testers were lied to and not shown apartments, even when they were available. And again, this case went to federal court and was settled by the town of Smithtown. So there was so you can see on the screen what the investigation found. But the issue is that if we're not conducting these paired testings, people might not be aware that they're receiving discriminatory treatment, or they might have a feeling, but they might not be able to prove it, that they're receiving discriminatory treatment based on their protected characteristic. So fortunately, some of the new bills that the New York State Senate passed include funding for more paired testing and regular paired testing. But this is part of why housing discrimination is able to proceed the way it does in our area. So segregated housing is a problem. It's harmful for hopefully obvious reasons at this point, but it also creates a lot of other problems in other areas that are less obvious than the housing itself. So segregated housing results in public school inequities and school segregation. It creates a lack of access to certain resources, a lack of opportunities, environmental or health concerns, wealth disparities, and disparate rates of homeownership. So what we're going to discuss briefly is school segregation on Long Island. And Erase Racism conducted a study looking at data between 2004 to 2016. And the first thing we found is that overall, Long Island schools are more diverse. Students in Long Island schools are more diverse. So in 2004, students were 70% white, 5% Asian, 13% Hispanic, 11% Black, and 0.1% other. Whereas in 2016, they were 55% white, 8% Asian, 25% Hispanic, 10% Black, and 2% other. So Long Island public school students are more diverse. That at face value is a good thing. But despite these changes, the fact remains that the number of students attending majority minority districts has more than doubled. So in 2004, 16 districts were majority minority, which means 50 to 100% non-white. In 2016, 39 districts were majority minority. So that's from 16% to 35%. And for those majority minority districts that are intensely segregated, the number of students attending has nearly tripled. So an intensely segregated district has 90 to 100% of non-white students. In 2004, that was at 5%, so 22,000 students. In 2016, 15% of students attend a majority minority district that is intensely segregated, so 65,000 students, which is triple in about 12 years. The bottom line of this research is that shockingly today, approximately 3 out of every 4 Black students and 2 out of every 3 Hispanic students attend a majority minority segregated school district. So you might be wondering how this is possible. You might not be wondering how this is possible so many years after Brown versus Board of Ed declared that school segregation is illegal. Long Island schools are the most segregated that they've ever been. How is this possible? It's a result of the housing discrimination that we looked at, both the historic housing discrimination that was never formally undone, but also the ongoing housing discrimination that continues to impact people today. So that has to do with school segregation, but in addition to educational inequities, residential segregation perpetuates disparate health outcomes for communities of color. So most of the Black and Hispanic communities on Long Island are from certain segregated communities because of segregated housing. So we're going to look at a statistic about the effects of COVID-19, and it's a very upsetting statistic. So white people on Long Island have died at a rate of 95.3 per 100,000 people from the COVID-19 pandemic. What do you think the age-adjusted rate of death for Black people on Long Island is per 100,000 people? You can put your guesses in the chat. Okay, so I see one guess, 250. 500. I'll wait for one more guess. Okay. The answer is 229 per 100,000 people. So that's almost 3 times higher than white people. So it's important to note that this isn't simply because of not wearing a mask or some individual issue of hand washing, and it really has to do with factors that result from structural racism that are related to housing. So we know that housing affects what school you go to. What school you go to can impact what job you get. In this country, what job you get affects your access to healthcare. It affects your likelihood to be a frontline worker, which would impact how likely you are to be exposed to COVID-19. So there's a lot of ways that housing impacts healthcare, especially here. And those are only a few of them that are contributing to this extremely disparate number, because we know that Black people are only about 13 to 15% of the population. So this doesn't make sense. This is extremely relative to the population. So segregated housing creates public school inequities and school segregation, a lack of access to resources, a lack of opportunities, environmental and health concerns, wealth disparities, and disparate rates of homeownership. These are all impacted by our ongoing housing segregation that we're working to combat. And again, what should you do if you feel that you have been discriminated against? If you feel that you or someone you know has been discriminated against, please reach out and make the call for help. Not only is it our individual responsibility to speak up for ourselves, but also to speak up against any housing discrimination we may witness, because if you're being discriminated against, you're not the only one. So again, I said I would put these up. So these are the numbers. If you've been discriminated against, you can contact any of these people, and I'll leave this up for a little while. So you can take the time to take a picture of the screen or write down any relevant phone numbers. And again, I'll just reiterate, there's too much at stake to not raise our voices if we or someone we know faces discrimination when we're buying a house. It impacts the whole region in many, many ways, as we've touched on. So there's about 15 minutes left, and if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself, and I'm happy to keep discussing this. Okay, so one question in the chat: are there any foundations or government entities that can help build fair housing apartments in an affluent, nearly all white community like Garden City? So Long Island is a remarkably fragmented place, right? So we have 125 school districts, we have 665 government entities, and each of these municipalities has their own zoning code. So there are developers who are trying to build affordable housing. It's a very slow process on Long Island in particular because of this complicated thing we have with exclusionary zoning and fragmentation. But there are people who are trying to do it. TriTech has a couple of properties that they're working on. And there's a few in Hempstead that I know of that are in the process of hopefully being approved. But if you're interested in possibly supporting that, I'm gonna put my email in the chat and you can reach out to me. And I can give you more information on how you might be able to support that effort, because Erase Racism is working to do that right now, actually. Another question, are there anti-bias programs for real estate agents, other efforts to combat racism in housing besides discrimination lawsuits? So there are anti-bias programs for real estate agents, and there are fair housing trainings. But in the past, what many people have found who are working on fair housing justice have found that they're sort of laughable, they're kind of ineffective, nobody takes them seriously. So part of what the Senate is trying to pass is more robust training so that people, especially on Long Island, understand the impact of our history and structural racism, the way that that's impacted housing here. So there are anti-bias programs, but we're working to have more and have more robust programs. Other efforts to combat racism in housing besides discrimination lawsuits. I mean, ideally, we work at the proactive side, so anti-bias programs is one effort to combat racism. Things like, besides a lawsuit, like really it's real estate education, both for the realtors, but also for the public so that they're aware if there's bias happening or discrimination. Other efforts, I'm trying to think of more. I'll keep thinking about this. What is your take on the role of racial bias in housing discrimination, whether it's on the part of the realtor or the homeowners, and how can it be combated? So even if a homeowner says to a realtor, I don't want you to sell my home to a Black person, the realtor is obligated to say, no, under fair housing laws, I'm not allowed to discriminate like that. So regardless of what the homeowner requests or wants, the realtor is not allowed to discriminate. And homeowners, as we mentioned, are also not allowed to discriminate. So say a homeowner is like, oh, I only want to sell to white people, and a realtor says, a realtor says, I can't service you then. The homeowner, even if they decide to sell their house on their own, is still liable to fair housing laws. Okay, and another to go back to an earlier question, other efforts to combat racism in housing besides discrimination lawsuits, individuals can try to influence people they know on this issue and the municipal government where they live. So we can all do things like first attending this training. We're having 2 more trainings, or 3 more trainings, 2 more in English, 1 more in Haitian Creole. And there's one in Spanish that is already on our Facebook page. So you can spread the word, have more people you know attend these workshops, or even if they can't attend the workshops, you can just tell them what you've learned here. And mobilize, if you see that there's an affordable housing being planned for your town, you can reach out to your town board, let them know that you support it. If you see a house for sale in your neighborhood, you can call the realtor and let them know that you want them to show that house to anyone who wants to live there, that you want anyone who wants to live there to live in your neighborhood, and that you're in favor of fair housing laws and that those matter to you. So those are a couple of other things on an individual level, efforts that can be done. Okay, has the Nassau County Urban Consortium been effective in promoting fair housing? I'm not sure. I'll have to look into that and get back, but I'm gonna save that question, and when I distribute the resources to those who have registered for the Zoom meeting, I'll have an answer. And if you are tuning in from Facebook and you would like to get those resources, but you haven't registered, you can send me an email and I'll make sure you get them. So my email is Nicole, Nicole, @eraseracismny.org. And I'll include these questions that have been asked and some answers and things that can be done. So is Erase Racism working on increasing the diversity of fair housing trainers? That's not something that we are actively working on, increasing the diversity of fair housing trainers, I guess passively, because we're working to increase the number of fair housing trainers in our network. Oh, promoting. I guess, yeah, I mean, we're promoting diversity in everywhere, in all trainers, in all fields of real estate and fair housing. And we already have some diversity in our trainers. So again, I would say passively, yes. Do you know of any programs or training available for BIPOC who are interested in homeowning for the first time? Many folks may not even know the ins and outs of the home buying process, and may not be as informed about when their rights are violated. So these workshops that we're offering are a good place to start. I believe that Fair Housing Justice Center might offer some, but I'll have to double check on that. But again, when I distribute resources, I will be sure to include any additional programs or training that I can think of. But this will be saved on our Facebook page. You can feel free to share it with anyone, or they can just attend the next one. Is it possible to know the realtors who have a good record on fair housing? Also the realtors who are known violators. Is it possible to know the realtors who have a good record on fair housing? I'm not sure. There's no master database. So beyond things like what Newsday has done, so some of those realtors are still allowed to work, but if you watch the Newsday investigation, then you would know that they were discriminating. But that's something that would actually be helpful and useful. Hypothetically, realtors are supposed to be punished when they violate fair housing laws, right? But we know that actually that has often not been the case, and that enforcement of fair housing laws has not been very robust to begin with. So it would be difficult to know who has a good record on fair housing, because it's not always, what's the word, enforced to begin with. These are great questions. So there's 5 minutes left. I will stay on and answer any questions. I'll also check if there's any questions coming through on Facebook. But I do want to say thank you all for attending and for participating. The next workshop is going to be on April 10th, and that one will be in English. These are all free. The one on April 10th, that's a Saturday. I believe it starts at 10 a.m. until 11:30 a.m. And we're also having one on Tuesday, May 4th at 6:30 p.m. So you can register for any of these on our website. You can also just tune in on Facebook Live. But thank you so much for coming. I will distribute the resources. And yeah, you can also, you register on our website. I'll put the link in the chat. It's eraseracismny.org.
Hi, Nicole.
Hi, Dolly. How are you?
Good, how are you doing?
Good, thanks.
Thanks for the wonderful presentation. I was just wondering, will you be sharing the slides?
I don't believe I don't think we will share the slides, but this presentation is available on our Facebook.
Okay, sounds great.
I'll find out about sharing the slides, but I'll send an email to everyone who registered through Zoom with the resources that I shared.
Sounds perfect. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks for coming. I'm going to stop the live stream, but thank you everyone who tuned in. Have a nice day.